Hello, welcome to CubsPS Plus The Signs, a new podcast designed to be a short dive into interesting numbers, trends, or plays related to the Chicago Cubs. I'm your host, Mike Waller. These episodes will be shorts that help shine a light on topics that either didn't fit into a recent episode or aren't big enough to warrant their own show. Everything in baseball starts with getting the signs. Signs define what's coming next. In this episode 2 of this podcast, I'm going to talk about the competitive balance tax, or CBT, and how it impacts what the Cubs do. Jed Hoyer was on 670 The Score last week, and he made a comment that he expected this team the Cubs this year to go over the competitive balance tax threshold. It's something that is not truly calculated until the season's over because there are a lot of moving parts. We'll get into what those parts are here in a second. But it took a lot of fans by surprise. With the CBT in general, there is a belief among fans that it's effectively a de facto salary cap. It's not. Some teams do treat it as such, so it certainly can be. There are additional costs and penalties that come with spending more than that level. So some teams aren't willing or able to do that. Many hold to the strong belief that the Cubs do treat it as a cap, and we'll get into that as well later. Their history is a mixed bag. But first, let's talk about what the CBT is. It's collectively bargained between the owners and the players. In its purest sense, not sure that anything in baseball actually operates as its purest anything ever. It's designed to help level some of the budgetary differences between teams. Not that it really does, given the huge differences in spending between teams like the Dodgers, Yankees, Mets, and say the A's and Rays, but that's the theory. The CBT is made up primarily of player salaries and player benefits. What's not always obvious is that player salaries can come in many forms. It includes active player payroll, payroll for players on the injured list, payroll for players with more than a year of MLB service time who are in the minors, and prorated MLB pay for other players on the 40-man roster who've played in the majors, and retained salaries of players who have been released or traded. Worth noting, the CBT is not based on actual money paid to players, but rather the average annual value of their contracts. So for players with multi-year contracts, it's not what they're actually paid that year, it's the average value of that contract over time. So if a player's contract is front-loaded or back-loaded, it can help the team when it comes to actual spend. But for CBT, it's just the simple AAV calculation. For example, if a player signs a 3-year, $60 million deal, but it's backloaded, maybe paying the player $15 million the first year, $20 the second year, and $25 the third year, it's not a varying level against the CBT. It's effectively $20 million per year for the life of that contract. This year's CBT threshold is $237 million, which is up from $233 million in 2023. The tax comes into play when teams exceed this number. The penalties escalate for teams that stay above the threshold in competitive years, so you'll often see teams try to quote reset and come down under that threshold to take away some of the repeater penalties. So for the penalties, the first year a team is over, the tax is 20% on all overages. So if a team this year spends $247 million total on the tax portion, the CBT portion of their payroll, they're going to result in a $10 million overage and a $2 million tax paid to the league. In the second year a team is over, the tax goes to 30% and then to 50% for the third and any subsequent year a team stays over the threshold. Now, it's just a choice. Ownership can choose to pay that. If you are Steve Cohen and you're an owner that wants to spend and have a big payroll and employ a lot of stars, you may decide just to live over that. Year after year after year, pay the penalties and all that. But this is why teams will try to reset. So take that 50% penalty back down for a year where you don't pay the tax, and then the next year you're back at the 20% threshold. There are additional surcharges if a team goes more than $20 million over the threshold. So you pay a 12% surcharge for overages of $20 to $40 million and a 42.5% surcharge for going $40 to $60 million over. And that becomes a 45% surcharge if you've done it in consecutive years. For teams going more than $60 million over, it's a 60% surcharge. So that money adds up fast. It's designed to try to keep baseball in a bit of parity in terms of spending. There's also a draft pick penalty for teams that go $40 million over the CBT. The team's first draft pick will fall 10 spots if you're more than $40 million over. Unless your first draft pick is in the first 6 of the MLB draft, then your second pick will move back 10 slots. And that matters. That has some value. That can be the difference between, the Cubs this year had the 14th pick in the draft and they took Cam Smith. or they could have been picking 24th had they been more than $40 million over in 2023. So what does it mean? I mean, is it a salary cap? It sort of is. It sort of replaces what the NFL and NBA have. So those leagues have centralized media rights. So all the TV deals, all the sponsorship deals, a lot of that money goes central to the league and is parsed out and divided among the teams. That's what allows those leagues to have a salary cap. You get a certain amount of money from the league revenues. Everybody takes a share. So everybody gets the same amount of revenue from the league. Baseball doesn't do that. Baseball has long done their own thing. Baseball has the haves and the have-nots. They have the Dodgers and the Yankees with TV deals that dwarf everybody else. The Cubs do quite well in their media market, but not as well as the Dodgers and Yankees. And then you have teams like the A's and the Rays who make way less money in revenues than the others and can't spend as much. Famously in Moneyball, I don't think Billy Beane actually said this, but the Billy Beane character in the movie, said there are teams that have money, teams that don't, 50 feet of crap, and then us. And that's where this comes into play. So what should the Cubs be doing? Let's talk about what the Cubs have done. So, since Tom Ricketts bought the team has gone over the luxury tax threshold. So it worked a little bit differently from 2015 to 2019 under different competitive collective bargaining agreements. I can't keep my CBTs for my CBAs. So, but similar effects. So in 2015, I'm going to call it CBT. I think it had a different name then, but it's effectively the same thing. 2015, the Cubs were 10th in payroll. The CBT was $189 million. The Cubs spent $154.9. In 2016, the Cubs were 4th in total payroll. It was again $189 million. Cubs spent $205.9 million and paid $2.96 million in tax. 2017, it was $195. Cubs spent $183.3. 2018, it was $197. Cubs were just under it at $193.3. 2019, the Cubs had the second highest payroll in baseball, $206 million threshold. Cubs spent $237.2 million. Cubs were over again in 2020, although that all wound up being weird with the shortened season and all. But based on real full season dollars, Cubs would have been third at $208 million threshold and spending $216.27 million. Cubs started to drop it back in 2021, obviously trading off a lot of the stars. It was $210 million threshold. Cubs spent $165.67. In the last 2 years, it was $230, $233, and $237. In 2022, the Cubs spent $180.5 million. Last year, the Cubs spent $230.3 million. This year, Spot Track projects them at $233.86 million, which would leave them about 3 and change under the CBT. There are additional calculations that go in there. There's a reason why it's calculated at the end of a season. So, for example, Cody Bellinger signed a 3-year, $80 million contract. If he stays and plays all 3 years, it winds up being, a third of that, $26.6667 million essentially. If he does opt out, that comes with a $2.5 million buyout. So if he opts out after the season, this year's luxury tax implication changes, and that buyout will go towards this season. And so he'll go from a $26.667 million contract to it'll effectively be a 1 year, $30 million contract. So that you could add $3.433 million to this year's luxury tax, which effectively would put them over the tax. So from the start of the season, I've said they were always going to be over the tax. I thought this team was going to be better. I thought they would add more at the trade deadline for starters. And then I thought there was a fair chance that Cody Bellinger will opt out. I still think there's that chance. We'll talk about that on the larger show. But there are also other things that factor into player pay. There are performance incentives, things like that. Baseball contracts are somewhat public. We have an idea what guys signed for. We don't know every last clause in their contract. So that's where, the Cubs have a couple people tasked with tracking where they're spending against the CBT. Sites like Roster Resource through Fangraphs or Spot Track do a pretty good job of keeping an estimation, but it's just an estimation. Even the major league teams don't always know the final numbers till the season's over. So the question is then, the Cubs, people already see that the Cubs will spend up to the threshold. The Cub fans haven't seen the team go over the threshold since effectively 2019. And teams will do this and try to maximize their windows. You know, the Dodgers went out and signed Shohei Ohtani to that huge, massive contract. It's a 10-year deal, but they probably, I'm sure they see the first 5 years as prime time for them to have Shohei Ohtani at his best, peak performance. Let's maximize that, try to win as many rings as possible in that window. And so you see them put the big deal out on Yamamoto. You see them make the trade for Tyler Glasnow and lock him up to an extension. The Dodgers are spending right now. They're set to win right now. The San Diego Padres decided about 2 years ago to push their chips in. They're spending money right now because they want to win. Teams on the build, on the rise, when the Cubs pulled back from that old core and traded Javi and Rizzo and KB and had moved on from so many of those guys, they pulled back, go younger. Let's not spend on the biggest free agents and all that. Let's get to where we want to win. When it's winning time, we'll start to spend more money. They've been creeping up to it. Cubs almost made the playoffs last year. Cubs look like they're going to come up short on the playoffs this year as well. It's getting closer and closer to time to spend that money. The Cubs will spend. I mean, the Cubs already, the Cubs payroll this year is 10th in baseball. They're the third biggest market, so it's not really equivalent spending. They have I think they have the most expensive fan experience at the ballpark in games. So they really should be spending more, and they're not. So the question is, how are the Cubs spending this much money? How did they wind up going over, and where's the inefficiency in the spend? So teams ideally want to spend efficiently. I want to spend efficiently. I have a household budget. I want to get the most out of life for that budget that I have. I don't make $20 million a year. So there are things I can't do that people who make that kind of money can do. But I can still have vacations. I can still spend money on a podcast that doesn't make me a lot of money. And so teams want to do the same thing. The goal of every team, the goal of building up the farm system the way Jed Hoyer has in recent years, is to have cost-controlled young players that make up the bulk of the team and free up money then to go spend a lot of cash on really good players. The question is, how well are the Cubs doing that? So if you look at the Cubs, I'm going to look at the 2024 spend. So when you break it down by categories, and SpotTrack does a really good job of laying this out, the competitive balance tax threshold is $237 million. The Cubs are spending $174,453,533. So $174.5 million roughly on guaranteed contracts. These are major league contracts, fully guaranteed, whether the player is in the majors or the minors, cut, released, traded, whatever. They're guaranteed their money. NFL does not have guaranteed contracts, but the NBA does. So NBA has to deal with this, and the NFL does not. So the bulk of their payroll is tied to guaranteed contracts. They're also currently paying about $7.8 million for players who are injured. The big category here, and what's really setting them back this year, is $28.2 million on retained contracts. And that's going to be players who, now some of that money is a little misleading. Some of that money is bad spend from bad decisions. In other cases, it's players who have been traded or released. We'll go through those in a minute. There's $17 million estimated for player benefits. Again, that will get finalized at the end of the year. And then there's $4.6 million estimated on on contracts effectively buried in the minor leagues. It's called minor league buried contracts. And then there's a $1.6 million estimated for pre-arbitration bonus pool for players who have not hit arbitration yet. So that's where some of that spending can be wonky, and we don't know how it's going to come out till the final tallies. But the active roster is what you would imagine. It's the guys who are currently on the active 26-man roster. And that is everybody from Cody Bellinger making $26.67 million this year, all the way down to Jack Neely, who just got called up, who will make a prorated $159,000 if he stays on the major league roster for the rest of the season. On the injured list right now, the Cubs are paying Adbert Alzolay $2.1 million, Yency Almonte $1.9 million, Jordan Wicks $741,000, not to being injured. Ben Brown $732,000, Colton Brewer $656,000, Luke Little $648,000, Hayden Wesneski $636,000, and Tomas Nido $405,000. That's going to happen. That's not a huge component of anything. It's random luck. I think there have been some studies done on this. The Pitcher List website, pitcherlist.com, has a really good 6-part, maybe 5 or 6-part piece on the CBT. Highly recommend the read. What's really hamstringing the Cubs is the retained salaries. So right now you'll see some other numbers in there. Hector Neris and his $9 million goes into that. Cubs are effectively only eating about $2 million. The other $7 million, they paid him to play for the team this year. Marcus Stroman had $2.67 million left over from his contract from when he opted out last year. That's a minor thing. Mark Leiter Jr. got traded, so the $1 million the Cubs paid him this year goes in there. Christopher Morel and his $907,000. But where this adds up is obviously the number of players you have to have. So the more injuries you have, the more players you have to bring up, the more players you maybe grab on waivers or from free agency, add them to your 40-man roster. So instead of maybe spending the season paying, maybe between guys who are guaranteed contracts and guys who shuttle up and down to the majors and minors, maybe you're paying 36 to 37 players. If you start stacking up the injuries or start stacking up poor decisions where you have to get rid of guys, maybe that expands to where you're paying 40, 42, 45, 50 players. And that's where you can creep up against the CBT. So the Cubs, on a more negative side of things, they're paying Trey Mancini $7 million this year not to play for them. They're paying Yan Gomes effectively $5 million not to play for them this year. He had a $6 million deal. I'm not sure if 5 is exactly the right number, but it shows as a $5 million hit against the tax on Spot Track. They're paying Tucker Barnhart, who they also let go last year, $2.5 million not to play for them this year. You start making those mistakes, and I'll call them mistakes because they're guys the Cubs signed last year. Trey Mancini and Tucker Barnhart in particular. Cubs signed them last year, didn't even make it through last season, but had them on multi-year deals. So you're just eating the second year. Now there's a trade-off. Once you've made that decision and it goes poorly, you can either subscribe to the sunk cost fallacy where I'm paying him, therefore I have to keep him. Or one of the benefits of being a larger market team and being able to, and occasionally willing to go over that CBT, is that you're able to decide to cut bait on a player. The Cubs last year were paying Jason Hayward $23 million to play for the Dodgers. It's not something that's ideal, but sometimes that's a better choice than keeping a bad player on the roster. So this is where the Cubs have had their issues. The Cubs, with better decision-making, Jed likes to talk about stacking good decisions on good decisions, and he's certainly made some. But by paying Jason Hayward last year, by signing Trey Mancini and Tucker Barnhart to 2-year deals, now they're paying, that's $10 million that if they were off the books could easily keep the Cubs under the threshold this year and not subject them to any tax. Now, I will also say, as far as the tax goes, I do not care about the tax. The Ricketts family are billionaires. They have tons of money. They can absolutely afford to pay the tax. I buy tickets. I buy Cubs gear. It's all really expensive. So use my money and pay enough salaries to have a good team. Totally get that. But what I do care about is the incentive over time. If the Cubs are going to pull back every couple years, I want to make sure the years they go over in a way that gets them into the playoffs. Hopefully they can make a run, hopefully get a championship again at some point. I don't want them this year. If they go over, they will go over in what I believe is the dumbest way possible. They will go a little bit over in the margins, not ultimately pay that much in terms of tax, but they'll start the escalator. So then next year that isn't 20%, next year's 30%. So again, where's that incentive to continue to spend more? If they go over, they're going to go over in the dumbest way possible, in my view. You look at the team, the Cubs have Cody Bellinger making $26.7 million. We've got Dansby Swanson making a tick over $25 million. Ian Happ is at $20 million. Jameson Taillon, 17. Seiya Suzuki, 17. Kyle Hendricks, 14.5. Shota, 13.2. Nico Horner, 11.7. Now, those guys a lot of them are actually worth their contract. I would say Cody Bellinger's not playing up to it this year. He's had injuries. I'm not sure how much that plays in. Dansby Swanson's had injuries as well this year. There's some questions whether he's worth that, but he is a Gold Glover at a premium position. And they can pay that much money and stay under the tax because they have a number. Michael Busch is making $741,000. PCA is making a prorated league minimum for $588,000. The bullpen is pretty cheap other than Hector Neris until he was let go. When you look ahead to 2025, with the money the Cubs already have guaranteed, they have $131 million already allocated towards the CBT for 2025. That leaves them about $88 million to theoretically to spend. Now, a lot of that's going to go to guys currently on the 40-man roster, young players who will stay pre-arb. Some of the arbitration players will stay and get their raises. That'll go. The more the Cubs have cheap, controllable talent on the bench, in the bullpen, the back end of the starting rotation where you can get productivity, guys like Michael Busch, Pete Crow Armstrong, that leaves space. The people talk about how the Cubs are not going to go spend on Juan Soto. I don't know if they will or they won't. I think it's too early to say they absolutely will not. But, if he's going to make $40 million, that would be almost half of the 88. So how are you going to fit that in? And how much are you willing to go over? Now, I would say, much like Shohei, if the Cubs were to invest in Juan Soto, that starts a window of, we want to win now while Juan Soto was young and very much in his prime. So those would be years where the Cubs would be likely to go over. So we'll see what happens, but that's where it goes. I hope the Cubs find a way to come in under, because going over by such a small pittance when the team has been just not quite good enough all year is absolutely maddening. So hopefully they'll find a way to stay under, or hopefully they'll find their way into the playoffs. Hopefully next year they go over. Hopefully it's a big spending year and they put a really good baseball team on the field, because Cub fans deserve it. Go Cubs.